these new friends that started at the same time. So, welcome everyone. We're thrilled to have you here at the Arizona Community Foundation. We're thrilled to be able to host this event, and I just can't tell you how exciting it is to see so many of you from not just the philanthropic sector, but from the business community, community leaders, from the banking community. It really does says an awful lot about this community for all of you to be here. It would be great too, whether they're new or not. We have a lot of foundation leaders that are far more senior than I here, that I saw around. Merle Washler, who's CEO of United Way, Jack Jewett, who's the CEO of Flynn Foundation. I see Bob Berger from upstairs, our neighbor from Williams. So there are a lot of folks from many foundations here, Dental Foundation, and so it's just great that you're here. There is a danger today because we, as Marissa said, we didn't just work together, we were friends. And so we could end up just catching up because we haven't seen each other in a while. And when you've worked at the Gates Foundation for 4 or 5 years, it does things to your brain. And so we're part of a global therapy group that address our 5 years working for Bill and Melinda Gates. But we're not going to talk about them because we both signed non-disclosure agreements and we don't want to be sued by them or the foundation. So, and I will say we're thrilled that you came here to Arizona. It's obviously means a lot to me personally, but certainly to our community that you saw the importance of coming here to talk to us about this. I'm going to want to start, Faye, with you talking about 2 things. One is the study that you did that we're going to talk about, that you did with CEOs of foundations all across the country. And 2, I think it's really important because Faye's job at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is probably one of the hardest jobs in the whole foundation, was to, she led the whole impact assessment area. Her job was to figure out what impact the billions and billions and billions of dollars we were investing around the globe were having. And how do you measure that? And how do you measure that properly and correctly and in innovative ways? And nobody had ever done anything like that in history. Tried to figure out the impact of philanthropy at that scale. So I'm going to have her talk a little bit about that as well. But I'd first like her to tell us about this really great study. I hope many of you read it, about CEOs of foundations and what you learned.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. It's great to see you and great to be here. Arizona is so beautiful. California is pretty nice, but this is very nice here. So thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. We had a great conversation earlier today with the Lodestar event, and lots of folks asked great questions there. So I really enjoyed that as well. So the genesis of this study was after I spent 4 years, sort of did my tour of duty at Gates, went overseas to Jerusalem, for a different kind of conflict zone, for a year. Had a great year there. And then while I was there, I got an invitation from Paul Brest, who was then the president of the Hewlett Foundation, to come and be a senior fellow at the Hewlett Foundation. And it sounded like a great invitation. I said, Paul, what does a senior fellow at the Hewlett Foundation do? And he said, I don't know, you're going to help us figure that out. So he said, come and do some thinking, do some writing, do some speaking, and advise our teams if they want your advice. And so that kind of invitation, how could you say no? And what it allowed me was sort of a luxury of time to have what I call sort of your stare at the wall time, or stare at the ceiling time, which I think we have not quite enough of in this sector. But I look at my kids as they're growing up, and they have a lot of stare at the ceiling time, and I was feeling a little jealous of all their stare at the ceiling time. So I was sitting in my beautiful office at the Hewlett Foundation, staring at the ceiling. We were in a presidential transition from Paul Brest, who had been there for 12 years, had built a really incredible professional foundation, to our next president. And I was thinking to myself, what makes for a successful foundation CEO? I've worked for a number of them, in a number of capacities, worked closely with a number of them, both as a consultant and inside a foundation. So I said, let me go take a look at what the literature says about this. Guess what I found? Really, almost virtually nothing. Virtually nothing was written about what does it take to run a successful foundation. So I thought, well, I have this luxury of time. Maybe I should talk to some CEOs about this. And so it started off actually as really a small project. And I was going to just write an op-ed piece somewhere about this. But then it grew because all the foundation CEOs I reached out to talk to were very eager to talk with me. And basically, because there was really no literature, and it's very hard to measure success, we talk about that too in terms of foundation CEOs, I basically decided to interview a range of foundation CEOs and basically ask them 3 questions. What are your greatest accomplishments, your greatest failures, and your greatest lessons? And from those interviews, which were fascinating and promised confidentiality across the board, I basically developed a pattern. A pattern emerged, both about successes and failures and lessons. And without going into the whole story, but because you can read the article, basically came up with a framework for foundation CEOs as master jugglers that have some similar characteristics as CEOs of other organizations, but also some unique ones for foundations. And what is it that they're juggling? They're juggling their board, engagement with their board, managing up to their board, understanding donor intent, trying to reduce idiosyncrasies of their board, lots of issues with the board. They're trying to manage within the foundation, the organizational culture, trying to create a healthy culture, a humble culture, sometimes. A culture where staff are aligned with the CEO and the board. And most importantly, they're trying to juggle results that they're aiming for, results on the ground. So trying to maintain attention to all 3 of those simultaneously. And each brings their own special challenge being in the foundations.
Oh, that's a great place to start, because when you think of a chief executive of any organization, the first thing you think of is that they are accountable for results. And then for those of you that know the philanthropic sector, if you add up all of us in the room that run foundations, we're making hundreds of millions of dollars in investments in Arizona every year, if you look at us collectively. And people wonder, well, what impact are you having with those investments? And it can be a community foundation where we make some 4,000 to 5,000 grants a year, some very large, some as low as $250. Some foundations make on a regular basis 7-figure or 6-figure grants every year. How should CEOs think about impact? How should their boards and how should the communities that they work in think about it?
Well, number one is that they should think about it. I think they should think about it together rather than isolated and alone. They should think about it in terms of what is it that we're trying to accomplish. What is it we as a foundation? What is it we as a set of nonprofits that's maybe working with the foundation in an area that we're trying to accomplish? Is it ambitious enough to be important, but manageable enough to actually be accomplishable, be realistic? And what are the pathways for getting there? For most social problems, no one foundation and no one nonprofit is going to solve it. So in addition to a foundation and a nonprofit thinking about impact and how we're going to achieve the impact that we're seeking, it's quite important and surprisingly hard for foundations to collaborate with each other. And we were talking about this a little bit last night when we did have a chance to catch up a little, Steve. To say, well, my foundation is particularly interested in this aspect of healthy children. Your foundation is particularly interested and equipped and capable in this other aspect. So let's work together. I'll do this piece, you do that piece. Let's have our grantees, our nonprofits talk to one another and so forth. So I think Collaboration is key, drawing on evidence for what has come before us and not having a sense of created here, which often happens with foundations, I think is also key. And then being ambitious about what it is you're trying to accomplish, sensible and systematic about thinking through the pathway for getting there, and then measuring progress along the way, and sharing that information as you gather it all the way up the chain. So being open with grantees being open with funders, there being good open exchange with the board. It gets a little messy, but I think that's the way you actually get real change to happen.
Well, that's a good word to use, messy, because the social sector, I would argue, is messy and often unpredictable. You never know what may happen in a community, or a nonprofit that's serving a community, or an institution that's serving a community, or even a government. And so in the for-profit sector, where I would argue they thrive on predictability and measurability for investment, and they're responsible to shareholders and stakeholders and boards like we are. But maybe this is the myth, is their environment more predictable, and how do you determine impact in these very messy social environments that are fluid and dynamic and changing all the time?
Well, whenever you begin to talk about determining impact or measurement of any kind, it's important to lead with purpose. So why is it that you want to know the answer to something? One of the CEOs in my study who I interviewed said, "It's amazing to me." She's a very rigorous thinker, leading a very serious foundation, and she said, "It's so surprising to me that my board, who are serious businessmen, and they look at measurement, they look at accountability in the business, they run their business according to that, and then they sit on the board of the foundation and they check that hat at the door. They lose all sense of rigor. So if the board isn't asking for it, it's very hard for the CEO to drive for it. And then the staff pick up that cue, and they know what is and isn't important and what is and isn't rewarded. So there are ways to do measures, maybe not 25 years from now when you see whether children become healthy, productive citizens, but there are certainly proxy measures along the way that we could say, are we on the right path? Are they reading in third grade? Are they getting their vaccinations? Are they healthy? Or whatever the shorter term markers, mile markers are. We have those. They're not impossible. And they can tell you, well, if they're not reading by third grade, things may not be looking so hot for us 25 years from now. So you know when it's time to course correct.
So, and that was one of the kind of essential elements you picked up in your study for CEOs, the engagement of the board. And you just gave, for those of you, how many of you sit on a nonprofit board? Okay, so you just heard, don't forget your business sense when you go to those meetings. So you're saying the relationship of the CEO and the board around impact is essential. And the board plays a critical role in that. And in your interviews with the CEOs, what did you draw from that about their relationships with their boards and the importance of that engagement at the standard that you just told us about?
It's the single most distinguishing feature of foundation CEOs, their relationship with the board. Because the boards often, they start off with the people who earn the money. They have a certain sense of how they want that money to be spent. It is their money. There's family members on the board. There's idiosyncrasies that grow up over generations sometimes on the boards. And I heard a lot of stories. I heard more, I would say, troubling stories than positive stories. There were a few really standout great stories. I'll tell you the great stories of the board engagement. The great boards were the boards that asked tough questions. And the Wallace Foundation, the CEO there, told great stories about how she had to really build up her board, created a team with her board. They ran board retreats, and she invited them to ask tough questions that board members knew enough about the work to push and probe and say, you know, why are we doing this, and how do we know, and can we do better? And they would push. They knew enough to be helpful, but they weren't so much in the weeds as to micromanage the work that was so far away. And those kinds of stories, like I heard at the Wallace Foundation, that was over the course of 25 years that she built that board. And the board built it itself as well, but for leadership, were rare. The theme was common, that the board asked tough questions. They knew enough to be helpful and serious, and they pushed for data, and they pushed for performance, and they pushed for why. They always asked the question of why and how do we know. I heard a lot of other stories where there was so much dysfunction.
Oh, good, because I want you to tell them. Those are the ones we really want to hear about.
There was so much dysfunction on the board where there was one story I heard from a CEO said, you know, the family members, they don't get along. The only time they see each other is in my board meeting. So you can imagine what a board meeting that was like with multiple generations.
You can stop. No, but it's a very important question, and whether if you are running a family foundation or you're running, you know, not all foundations, some are corporate foundations, but let's take family foundations, and you know, the Gates Foundation was essentially a family foundation.
On steroids.
On steroids, right. We're not supposed to. But let's talk about that, because I want to ask you about, given your focus on data and impact and measurement, when you talk to these CEOs, how did they talk about building that alignment? I mean, they're juggling, as you said, they're artful jugglers. Board engagement is just one part. They got to, as you wrote about, building organizational culture and achieving impact. But let's talk about a family that sets up a foundation and is really passionate about what they want. But their interests are driven purely by passion and by their heart and their feelings about what they like to do. And you're the CEO, and you know that if you're going to invest that money that way, that does not align with any data or any evidence around making an investment that is really important to the family. Did any CEO share that, or what did you learn about that juggling act, about engaging the board on something they're very engaged with, but investing in that might not be a smart decision?
Well, a couple things. One is, I am not anti-passion. Right, so I think, thanks for the laugh. But I think passion is really important. So you know, when you describe a family or board that's bringing passion to the table, that's great. You wouldn't want to have a foundation without passion, but you also wouldn't want to have it without data. So, so just to say it, I think sometimes we falsely create a dichotomy between the two, and obviously I think the power is in the blend. You know, I heard some stories that were pretty dire. One story where a family that was on the board, was mostly family run, although there were some friends of the family and some professionals on the board, but it was basically a family run board where they were investing in certain kind of programs. They felt very strongly about those programs, made big money bets on those programs. The CEO did evaluate the programs, did commission evaluations of the programs. They came back as this may not be working out in the way that you wanted or expected. And within very short order, the foundations, in 2 cases, were essentially shut down. So that was in that case, there were 2 cases that I interviewed where that happened, where folks just didn't take kindly to being told, actually, this isn't a good bet. you know, there are others where I heard stories about, you know, about, and I would agree with this, about bringing evaluative thinking into the boardroom and into the culture of the organization, so that you're thinking about, okay, this is our passion, this is our area of giving, that's great. What can we learn from what's come before? And how do we bring champions in for this issue, for these kinds of programs? May not be your pet program or your pet idea, but they may actually be a better pathway, a stronger pathway for getting to the goal, for achieving the goal.
So, assuming that the CEO is able to do that juggling artfully with the board, there's another piece, and that's the staff and the culture of the organization. And you kind of touched upon that. So the third element that you mentioned is that building a healthy organization. And sometimes the views of staff who are out in the field every day and have the wisdom of many years, and I'll say this in the most respectful way, the street smarts about what's really happening or not happening. And that doesn't reconcile with some other issues. And they are passionate about getting it right. So how did the CEOs you talked to handle that? That's the three now together, the board engagement, the impact assessment, and building a healthy culture. How did that come together best, so when those situations arose, there were solutions and there were opportunities for the foundation to move forward?
Yeah.
Not that that ever happens in my foundation.
Yeah. It's a multi-dimensional question, Steve, so let me start answering it, but if I don't fully answer it, you can come back at me.
Well, you told me yesterday you'd answer whatever you wanted to.
We have 5 minutes left.
Okay, there were some CEOs I interviewed, and I'm only giving examples when I was given permission, but the person who spoke most eloquently about the importance of a healthy culture was Patty Stoneslaker, who was our boss at the Gates Foundation, who was the CEO during most of the time that we were there, though not all of it. And, you know, upon reflection, and now there's 4 years later, since she had, or at least since she had left that post, that was the one area where she felt like she hadn't done as good a job as CEO at the Gates Foundation, that in terms of building a healthy culture, that we didn't have that so much. And she made the case for that being so important, and she compared the foundation world to the hospitality world, and said, you know, the front of the house has to match the back of the house. That if you want your employees to treat your customers well, you have to treat your employees well. Whatever the culture is with your employees, that gets conveyed to your customers. And she said the same thing is true in foundations, that the culture within the foundation is transmitted to the nonprofits and their grantees. And that she could have done a better job, and that we could have done a better job in terms of organizational culture, building a healthy culture, and that would have lent itself to healthier relationships with our grantees and also healthier results. And, you know, it was brave of her to talk about that, courageous. So that was the best example. I would say too that there weren't many CEOs who I interviewed, and I wrote about this a little bit, who felt like they were equally skilled in all three of those domains. You know, and Patty was a great example where she was great with her board, and she was great focusing on results. She knew every strategy inside and out. She grew up with them. They grew up with her. She knew everything about them. But on the inside, work, less focus. And that was a choice, but maybe not the wisest of choices. And that's what she would say now. And the other thing that she would say, and I'll end on this because I know we have to wrap up, but in terms of staff, and you know, the staff of street smarts and not, one of the things that she said, I thought that was also pretty important, was that we had a lot of really smart people at the AIDS Foundation, top of their class, elite universities. What we were short on was wisdom. And that one of her pieces of advice was to hire people with a little bit more wisdom, who'd been there, understood the issues, understood the communities, understood the people that we were seeking to help.
She was quoting me.
Well, we have some little time for
Okay,
audience
great.
questions. You've been doing a great job, Stephen.
Thank you. Terrific. Okay. Questions? Don't be bashful. Please. Rick?
Long-term versus short-term results. How do you, as a CEO, how do you manage those with your board? Many of your board members come in with relatively high expectation of immediate results. They want quarterly outcomes. And some of what we do in foundation work is really, it plays out over a much longer period of time. Relationships play out over a longer period of time. How do you manage those short-term and long-term expectations?
You do both, I think. And did everybody hear the question? How do you manage short-term, long-term results? And I think you do both. It's quite important. I've seen a lot of foundations, this is separate from the research, but I've seen a lot of foundations that focus just on that, final right-hand side of the page of a theory of change where it's their final impact goal. Graduation, high school graduation, going to college nationwide. And that actually, it's good to track that, but it's not actually actionable. So, what you hope to happen 15, 20 years down the road, it's good to understand how that's fluctuating. But in terms of your pathways for getting there, that's the value, we were talking about this a little bit earlier today, of having a theory of change and logic model, dare I say it, because that really lays out, what is it that you're trying to do? How do you think you're going to get there? And what are the mile markers along the way that will tell you whether you're on a path? And if you're not on that path, then you might need to do something different. And if you are in the path, keep going. So I think you really need both, but I think quarterly is probably too often.
Other questions? Yes.
I have a question, to be blunt, about how board members should know about when it's time to go. And the reason I ask that question is that
Time for the CEO to go or time for the board member to go?
board member to go.
Okay. Time for the board member.
I'm not sure I get a microphone. I usually talk too loud and too fast. But I was at a conference and the director of the Philadelphia Museum of Art was talking about leadership. And he described a board member who'd been on his board for 40 years and said that with some of the changes that he was implementing, she said something to the effect that that will be very difficult to do because change is difficult. Change will be hard for us, she said. And I asked him, did she really mean change would be hard for us, meaning the museum, or did she mean change would be hard for me because I've been here for so long? And his response was interesting. It wasn't about longevity in terms of years. It was about longevity in terms of vision. But the thing is, people don't always get it. So how does somebody know when they get the vision and they're going with the flow, and how do they know when they're like the lava that's frozen and is keeping people from achieving things? And how do you communicate that as that CEO, artful juggler, to make sure that the board members are hearing the messages and following the vision of the institution? Because it's not always that easy.
Well, that's a great question, and I'm sure that you have something to add to that too, Steve. But I guess I would say sometimes they can't know, and that's the beauty of term limits. Right? I mean, so I'm a big fan of term limits, both for boards and actually for program staff and foundations. So one of the things that the Yale Foundation has is 8-year term limits for all program staff. And it is really a great, it's a great regulation. Because
Your term limits for
program staff, program officers, program directors. Anybody that's responsible for grant making, that has authority over grant making. Because what does it do? It provides a sense of urgency to get something done in 8 years. I'm answering a different question, but.
I know, but that's surprising.
Yeah, it is, but it's great. It gives you a sense of urgency to get something done in 8 years. It reduces hubris, because you have to go back out in the marketplace and get a job, so you can't be a jerk. And it brings fresh ideas. So within 8 years, your strategy is probably ready to have a fresh look, fresh ideas. And even if you try to really create a culture of questioning, curiosity, and learning and bringing in data, there's still nothing like a fresh perspective. So I have seen, it has downsides. You've got stars you wish they weren't leaving, and they do, but then they go out to do other great things in the community. So it's a way of seeding a great staff in other foundations and other organizations as well. But I think the same thing is true for boards. I think having 3-year terms that can be up to 3 times consecutive gives you 9 years. That's a lot of time already. And you can make exceptions, but 40 years. I grew up in Philadelphia. I was 11. He was probably still on the board. I was going to visit the museum.
Well, I would agree with Faith. Having a structure helps. I mean, it's difficult when you have, like we had at Gates, we had trustees, we had a family. They're not changing, whether we want to institute term limits or not. So family foundations obviously operate differently. But they also have an obligation to know that about themselves. I mean, it is their money and it's their family and it should be theirs, and they have that sense of ownership and possession and their view and vision. And here at the Community Foundation, our job for many of the families that set up foundations here and then pass on, leave us with instructions about what they want done in perpetuity, and there's a place for that. But in other foundations where you don't have a structure which could lead to this calcification or something after lava, you said, after 40 years, that's not good for the organization, it's not good for the CEO, it's not good for the community. Because what a foundation should do, as Faye said, I think, is who else but foundations to take risks that others can't take? Who else but foundations to make mistakes and say, we're going to learn from that mistake, and we're going to get better, and we're going to do it better, and we'll learn the next time. And if you get so caught in your space that you have no influx of new ideas, new perspectives, new vision, ultimately the intent of the philanthropy will not reach its optimal level. So it helps. When I came to ACF, we had term limits, but they weren't enforced, and the board enforced them. Now, as a CEO, all the people that hired me are now leaving the board. I'm not happy about that because I feel a kinship to them and a relationship. And they knew the whole history. But that's not in my best interest. For me to be sharp as a CEO and our staff to be sharp is we're going to have new ideas all the time brought into this foundation because we're constantly bringing in new governance and new perspectives, and I think that can only be healthy for the future.
You guys question orthodoxies that way.
That's right.
Things that we take as just given, this is the way we do it.
Yes.
A new board member comes on and says, well, why?
Right. Exactly.
Okay, that may be an appropriate time to end. I just want to, first of all, acknowledge that Faye has a plane. Can you hear me? Hear me now? She has a plane to catch, and Robert is her chauffeur, so she'll stay for a little while longer, but we wanted to make sure we gave her enough time just to sort of debrief before she had to rush out the door. But because she's leaving soon, I want to acknowledge Faye and give her a small token of our appreciation. She's doing this for free. I promise you don't have to take this on the plane. We will send it to you. This is a Cosante bell that AGF has made specially, so it's got our flapper, and it's just a beautiful bell that when you hang it wherever you do in your home, it'll remind you of Arizona and AGF. So